a murder movement. These are some of the terms floated by Fox News this week to describe the Black Lives Matter movement, a movement that says it exists to demand accountability and justice for victims of police violence. Here's a few of the comments made on Fox this week.
Kevin, why has the Black Lives Matter movement not been classified yet as a hate group? I mean, how much more has to go in this direction before someone actually labels it as such?
I think they're a hate group. They hate police officers.
Well, they have strong feelings about
No, they hate them. They want them dead. Pigs in a blanket is dead.
I don't think we're watching the same Black Lives Matter movement. I think if you talk to any of the organizers on the ground, both in Ferguson, in Baltimore, and New York, they will tell you they're a non-violent movement, that all they want to do is end the disparities.
Why were they chanting pigs in a blanket?
We've fronted out.
That was the Black Lives Matter movement in Minnesota. Why?
Here's some context for what you just saw. This on-air offensive came after recent killings of police officers and
pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon.
for some reason, some of the organizers said that was actually in humor, some attempt at being playful. Let's talk about the backlash against Black Lives Matter in some corners of the press. Is it warranted, or is a dangerous connection being made between the movement and a misunderstood message? Joining me here in New York, Cornel West, professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and in Philadelphia, Marc Lamont, a CNN political commentator and professor at Morehouse College. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
First, that clip that we just saw, the pigs in a blanket comments, Cornel, doesn't the movement itself, don't some of the people that support the movement undermine it with hateful remarks like those?
Well, I think we had to keep it in mind that, you know, they said the same thing about Martin King, said the same thing about SNCC. Anytime you have black rage expressed based on black suffering in the face of white fear, grounded in white privilege, that clash is one in which you're going to get, in fact, some hyperbolic rhetoric. There's no doubt about that.
You're saying it was only hyperbolic?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, have you seen them go about engaging in any kind of injurious harm to police? There's no evidence of that whatsoever.
It seems to me the video demonstrates the double-edged sword of this digital media age, that everything's being recorded means that these protesters can get their message out, but can also potentially undermine themselves. Mark, when you saw that video, what did you make of it?
I didn't make much of it, and here's why. You know, I've been on the ground in Ferguson. I've met with in terms of organizing the BLM founders and many of the people engaged around the country, and that's just not part of the planning dialogue. That's not part of the engaged action that we see on the ground. Every struggle I've ever been a part of, there are always outliers. There are always occasional folk who show up who often co-opt or twist the message. And to Professor West's point, yeah, there will be people who engage in hyperbolic rhetoric, but that's very different than being genuinely committed to injuring law enforcement. There's no evidence of that.
So do you feel that those Fox News hosts were seizing on these comments in order to paint with too broad a brush? What do you think happened this week? It seemed like Fox had a narrative very clearly.
Oh, absolutely.
They did have a narrative, and it's very different than the narrative they had when the Tea Party had people with racist signs and people who had Obama looking like a monkey. They said, "Oh, those are outliers. They don't represent the Tea Party movement as such. Those are extra folk who we dismiss." Well, why can't the same sort of generosity and be given to those involved in this movement?
You made a comment earlier, Cornel, about Dr. Martin Luther King. You were suggesting that the same sorts of attempts were made to delegitimize the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That you're seeing that happen now.
Oh, yeah, Brother Martin was viewed
Tell us
as
a
a
specific example.
Brother Martin was viewed as a hater. He was viewed as a troublemaker. He was viewed as a divisive figure trying to undermine a status quo in which white persons were living in a world of denial, and yet he persisted because he had integrity.
Mark, have you found this to be effective at all this week, this new rhetoric from Fox News and from conservative commentators describing Black Lives Matter as a literal hate group?
Well, I think it's been effective in ginning up the base. I think it's been effective in distracting us from the fundamental issues that we should be preoccupied with. Now, we should devote some time to saying, wait a minute, what happened to those police officers is wrong. It's a moral atrocity if someone stalks and murders a police officer, but we should be able to do that and still have a sustained conversation about police terrorism, about state violence, about mass incarceration. The problem is when that rhetoric spikes up about BLM, Black Lives Matter movement being a hate group, it distracts us. Many of us have become entered into a defensive posture where we're trying to defend that, and we're having a conversation about that instead of these core issues. And I think that is exactly what particular media outlets, and I'm not just talking about Fox News, I'm also talking about pockets of social media, what they're committed to doing. Their sole purpose there is to troll the world, essentially, and convince us that the suffering we're facing is not as essential as this distracting conversation.
At the same time, the voices of police officers need to be taken seriously. We've heard them on CNN, we've heard them on Fox, we've heard them elsewhere. Many of them do believe there is a very serious threat to them because of rhetoric, not because of the movement necessarily, but because of a climate that we're in.
No, I don't think they have grounds for that.
No?
No, I think part of the moral impulse behind Black Lives Matter is that innocent life must not be violated, must not be taken, yet unfortunately, oftentimes the innocent lives that are taken by state-sponsored figures tend to be black and brown people.
Before I have to go, Mark, I'm curious because, like as you mentioned, you were in Ferguson multiple times in the past year. It's been a little bit more than a year since Michael Brown did die there. Do you feel that Black Lives Matter has been overall winning the media war for attention?
They're winning the war for attention, but it's important to note that the work they're doing is not just to create the spectacle. The spectacle is the entry point into significant social justice, significant social change, and policy change. So a year later, we're talking about body cameras. We're talking about state violence. We're talking about oversight of police. We're talking about citizen review boards. You can't run for mayor in a city right now and not talk about what your plan for policing is. You can't run for president and not talk about Black Lives Mattering. That is a testimony to the power and the strength of this movement and to the power and strength of those three black women who created a movement that has the world on its heels.
Marc, Cornel, thank you both for sharing your thoughts with us this morning.